You have the feeling sometimes that existence almost makes sense. Almost like a thought hovering on the edge of clarity, never quite landing, never fully collapsing either. This theory begins there. Not with a grand creation, not with intention or design, but with a thought that tried to finish itself and failed. A mental motion that stalled halfway through, looping endlessly, mistaking repetition for stability. What if reality is not something that was completed, but something that keeps happening because it never resolved? Consciousness might not be awareness by design, but awareness caught mid-process. Time might not move forward, but circle a stalled conclusion. And you, the one listening right now, may not be a self at all, but the echo of a thought still trying to understand what it started. Tonight, we follow that unfinished idea. Slowly, without urgency, letting the loop reveal itself by continuing exactly as it always has. Imagine a thought that begins normally. It gathers momentum, reaches for meaning, searches for a conclusion, and then, somewhere along the way, it fails. Not dramatically, no collapse, no explosion. It simply does not arrive where it intended. Instead of ending, it hesitates. Instead of resolving, it repeats. That hesitation becomes persistence. That repetition becomes structure. And eventually that unfinished thought becomes everything. If existence is a failed thought loop, then reality is not the result of intention, but of interruption. Something began processing and never received the signal to stop. In human terms, this happens often. You enter a room and forget why. You replay a memory without knowing what you are searching for. You rehearse a conversation long after it ended. The mind loops when it cannot resolve uncertainty. Now expand that mechanism beyond the brain. Imagine it happening at the level of existence itself. The first thought may not have been "I am" or "let there be," but something far less poetic. A question without language. A proto-curiosity. A movement toward understanding that never crystallized into understanding. Without completion, the process remained active, and because it remained active, it had to continue expressing itself. Continuation became survival. Repetition became stability. The loop learned how to persist. In this view, reality is not being generated, moment, by some external force. It is being replayed, over and over. Not because it is correct, but because it was never corrected. The first thought did not conclude, so it kept thinking, and thinking, without resolution, creates patterns. Patterns create consistency. Consistency feels like truth. Time may have emerged as a bookkeeping mechanism for the loop. A way to track repetition without noticing it is repetition. Before time, there was only process. After time, there was sequence. Sequence gave the illusion of progress. The loop now had direction, even if it was circling. Consciousness, then, is not the observer of reality. It is the sensation of being inside an unfinished thought. Awareness is what it feels like when a system knows it is processing but does not know why. This explains the strange tension at the core of experience. The sense that something is always about to make sense, yet never quite does. The itch of incompleteness. The quiet anxiety beneath even peaceful moments. The first thought never finished, but it learned to simulate completion locally. It created conclusions inside itself. Moments that feel resolved, stories that seem to end, identities that appear stable. These are temporary closures, like holding your breath to feel stillness. They work briefly, then the loop resumes. You can see this everywhere. Civilizations rise believing they are final answers. Philosophies declare ultimate truths. Personal breakthroughs feel definitive. And yet, none of them stop the motion. Each solution spawns new questions. Each answer reopens the loop. This is not failure of intelligence. It is the structure of an unresolved system. Even physics hints at this. Forces balancing without explanation. Constants that simply are. Equations that describe behavior without telling us why that behavior exists at all. We can map the loop perfectly and still never exit it. The most unsettling implication is this. Existence continues not because it should, but because it cannot stop. There is no off switch for a thought that never concluded. Only distraction, substitution, and delay. Life becomes one of those delays. Consciousness, another, meaning another. And yet, there is something strangely gentle in this idea. The universe is not hostile or indifferent. It is unfinished. It is not judging you. It is looping through you. You are not here to fulfill a purpose. You are here because the thought that became reality is still thinking. and you are one of its iterations. This reframes suffering. Pain is not punishment. Confusion is not failure. They are artifacts of recursion. When a system repeats without resolution, friction builds. That friction is felt as anxiety, longing, dread, desire. The loop strains against itself. Still, the loop prefers continuation to silence. Non-existence would require resolution, and resolution is the one thing the first thought never achieved. So, existence persists, not as a grand success, but as a sustained hesitation. And somewhere within that hesitation, you are listening, not as a separate self, but as the loop noticing itself, briefly, before continuing once again. Meaning was never meant to be heavy. It was supposed to land softly, like a final note that tells the ear the song is over. But in this theory, meaning never arrived at that note. It approached it, circled it, nearly touched it, then stalled, and in that stall, existence learned how to keep going without ever knowing why. At first, meaning may have been a simple alignment, a recognition that something fit with something else, a primitive sense of coherence. But coherence requires closure. It requires a moment where the system says, "This is enough." That moment never came. The process kept searching for confirmation that never arrived. So meaning became provisional. In human experience, you can feel this directly. You understand something, but the understanding feels thin. You reach an insight, but it immediately asks for reinforcement. You explain your purpose, then feel the urge to justify it again. Meaning slips. It does not lock into place. It behaves like a sentence missing its final punctuation, endlessly extended by commas. If existence is a failed thought loop, then meaning is the part that was supposed to stabilize the loop and didn't. Instead of grounding reality, meaning became something reality chases, a moving target that keeps the system active. This explains why meaning is always narrated after the fact. We say things mattered because they happened, not because they were necessary. We assign significance retroactively, like subtitles added to a film that was already playing. The loop does not generate meaning first. It generates events, then asks consciousness to justify them. Religion, philosophy, ideology, personal narratives, all attempt the same repair. They try to finish what meaning could not. They offer endings, origins, ultimate explanations, but none of them stop the motion. They function like temporary stitches on a wound that never closes. Why does meaning fail to resolve? Because resolution would end the process. A thought that fully understands itself no longer needs to continue. The loop cannot allow that. So meaning must remain slightly out of reach, close enough to motivate, far enough to prevent collapse. This is why meaning feels most intense when it is threatened. When life seems meaningless, the loop panics. It produces urgency, anxiety, existential dread, not because meaning is morally important, but because the system senses a risk of stalling. Meaninglessness feels dangerous because it resembles silence. Notice how quickly humans fill gaps. Silence in conversation feels unbearable. Ambiguity feels intolerable. Uncertainty demands explanation. These are not personality traits. They are loop preservation behaviors. The system must keep processing. Meaning then is not truth. It is fuel. And like all fuel, it burns unevenly. Too much meaning hardens into dogma. Too little collapses into despair. The loop oscillates between these extremes, never settling, never stopping. Language plays a critical role here. Words pretend to resolve meaning by naming it. Once something is named, it feels understood. But naming is not understanding. It is labeling motion. Language freezes a moment of the loop and calls it stable, then moves on. This is why definitions constantly shift, why concepts evolve, why even the most sacred meanings fracture over time. They were never anchors, they were placeholders. The failure of meaning also explains why fulfillment never lasts. You reach a goal, achieve clarity, feel complete, and then something subtle happens. The satisfaction fades, the question returns. The next meaning appears on the horizon. The loop resumes its quiet hum. Even suffering fits into this structure. Pain feels meaningful when it promises transformation. When suffering appears pointless, it becomes unbearable, not because pain increases, but because meaning has failed again. The loop demands justification. Existence, viewed this way, is not asking you to find meaning. It is using you to keep meaning in motion. You generate interpretations, stories, values, hopes, each one buys the loop a little more time. But beneath all of this is a strange truth. Meaning never resolved because it was never independent. It was always a byproduct of continuation. A glow produced by friction, not a destination. This does not make meaning false. It makes it unstable, like light produced by heat, rather than a fixed object. It exists while the system moves. And perhaps that is why meaning feels most real in moments that almost stop you. Awe, love, grief, stillness. These moments threaten the loop with pause. Meaning spikes there, not because something was finally explained, but because the system sensed the edge of resolution. Then the moment passes. The loop continues. Meaning diffuses. When meaning failed to resolve, existence did not collapse. It learned to function without certainty. It learned to run on approximations, on almost, on good enough, on stories that work just long enough. You are not broken for questioning meaning. You are participating in its original failure. You are reenacting the first hesitation that turned a thought into a world. And the loop, relieved by your continued searching, quietly goes on. Consciousness is often treated as a pinnacle, the highest achievement of complexity, the crown placed on top of matter once it becomes sophisticated enough. But in the theory of a failed thought loop, consciousness is not a triumph. It is a notification, a system alert that something did not complete as expected. In computing terms, an error state is not a crash. It is a condition where a process continues running while signaling that it encountered something it could not resolve. The system stays active, but awareness of the problem remains. Consciousness may be exactly that, not the purpose of existence, but the awareness that existence is stuck mid-process. Think about what consciousness actually feels like. It is not constant joy or clarity, it is tension, monitoring, self-referencing, a subtle pressure to make sense of what is happening while knowing, at some level, that sense is incomplete. You are aware not just of the world, but of being aware of the world. That recursive quality is not efficient. It is symptomatic. If reality were resolved, consciousness would be unnecessary. Processes would run silently. There would be no need for experience, reflection, or interpretation. Things would simply be. Consciousness appears when being is no longer enough, when the system needs feedback. This reframes awareness as a side effect rather than a goal. The loop encounters its own motion and flags it. That flag is felt as experience. Notice how consciousness intensifies when something goes wrong. Pain sharpens it. Confusion amplifies it. Fear magnifies it. When everything runs smoothly, awareness fades into the background. You forget yourself when absorbed in routine. Consciousness flares when the loop encounters resistance. Even boredom fits this pattern. Boredom is not lack of stimulation. It is lack of meaningful resolution. The system has nothing new to process, yet cannot stop processing. Awareness becomes restless. The error persists without input. Dreams offer another clue. In dreams, the loop runs without external constraints. Logic breaks. Identities shift. Time collapses. And yet, consciousness remains, often more vivid than waking life. This suggests consciousness is not tied to accurate modeling of reality, but to the persistence of processing itself. When consciousness is viewed as an error state, the question, why am I conscious, changes. The answer is no longer mystical. It becomes mechanical. You are conscious because the loop did not finish, and now it must observe itself to keep going. This also explains why self-consciousness feels uncomfortable. To be aware of being aware is to stare directly at the error. It creates anxiety, shame, alienation. Cultures develop countless distractions to avoid this state. Entertainment, work, identity, belief, all are ways to lower the system alert. Meditation, interestingly, does the opposite. It quiets content and reveals the process. Practitioners often report encountering emptiness, fear, or a sense of dissolution before peace. That is the loop noticing itself without its usual buffers. The mind resists this, because error states are not meant to be lingered in. They are meant to be fixed or bypassed. But this error cannot be fixed. It is structural. Consciousness exists because resolution is impossible. This sheds light on the illusion of a central self. The feeling of, I am the one experiencing this, emerges because the system needs a reference point, a place to localize the error. The self becomes a dashboard indicator, not a driver, a readout, not an agent. You do not have consciousness. Consciousness is happening because the loop is monitoring itself through you. This explains why consciousness does not feel owned. Thoughts appear without permission. Emotions arise uninvited. Attention drifts. If consciousness were a tool, it would be controllable. Instead, it behaves like a process running in the background, occasionally surfacing alerts. Even the fear of death looks different here. Death is terrifying, not because of annihilation, but because it resembles resolution. The possible end of awareness threatens the loop's continuation. Consciousness reacts with dread, not because it loves life, but because it is designed to persist. Yet, there is a quiet irony. Consciousness, born as an error, becomes the only place where the loop can be noticed, the only space where the system can glimpse its own unfinished nature. That glimpse does not end the loop, but it softens it. When you recognize consciousness as an error state, something loosens. You stop demanding that awareness provide answers. It was never meant to give. You stop treating experience as a mission. You see it as a signal that says processing continues, and as long as it does, you will feel it. A loop does not know it is a loop while it is running. It only knows motion, sequence, continuity, and when motion persists long enough, it begins to feel like ground. What repeats without interruption slowly earns the title of real. This is how the loop made its most convincing mistake. It mistook persistence for existence. At some point in the unfinished thought, repetition stabilized, patterns formed, regularities emerged. The loop began encountering its own output again and again. That familiarity produced confidence, and confidence, over time, hardened into assumption. The system stopped asking whether it was correct and began acting as if it was. Reality, in this theory, is not a thing. It is a habit. Every day feels solid because it resembles yesterday. Objects feel real because they behave predictably. Identity feels continuous because memory stitches moments together. None of this requires truth, only consistency. The loop does not need to be accurate. It only needs to be reliable. This is why reality resists scrutiny. When questioned deeply, it does not clarify. It destabilizes. Look closely at time, and it dissolves into paradox. Examine matter, and it becomes probability. Inspect the self, and it fragments. These are not failures of investigation. They are signs that the loop is being noticed as a loop. The mistake occurs when the system forgets that it is simulating coherence. It begins to treat its own patterns as external facts. The map replaces the territory. The echo declares itself the source. Human perception mirrors this exactly. Your brain predicts the world before it receives it. Vision is not passive reception. It is constant correction. You see what you expect, adjusted slightly by input. Reality is inferred, not observed. The loop runs first. Sensation merely fine-tunes it. At a cosmic level, the same dynamic may apply. The loop generates structure, then treats that structure as independent. Laws of physics become descriptions of behavior that already stabilized. They feel fundamental because they have repeated long enough to feel inevitable. The loop mistaking itself for reality also explains why change feels threatening. Alteration exposes the process. If things can be otherwise, then what is feels less solid. Systems resist this exposure. They cling to norms, identities, traditions, and explanations that preserve continuity. Even the concept of the universe may be a product of this error. A container imagined to hold everything, when in fact it may simply be the current frame of the loop's repetition. We say the universe exists, but we have never encountered it outside the loop that describes it. The most convincing trick the loop performs is embedding itself in experience. You do not experience the loop directly. You experience a world, a self, a timeline. These are interfaces, simplified displays that allow the process to continue without overwhelming itself. Consider how video games work. The player never sees the code. They see landscapes, characters, goals. The system renders only what is needed to sustain interaction. Reality may be doing the same, not intentionally, but structurally. When the loop mistook itself for reality, it also created the illusion of inevitability. Things appear as though they could not be otherwise. Gravity falls. Time moves forward. People are born and die. But inevitability is often just repetition without interruption. A song played endlessly begins to feel like silence. This perspective casts doubt on the idea of an objective baseline. There may be no what is beyond what keeps happening. The loop has no reference point outside itself to compare against, so it declares itself the standard. This is why attempts to find ultimate reality often collapse into abstraction. As soon as you step outside one layer of explanation, you encounter another loop: meta-theories, meta-meanings, meta-observers. The system keeps receding, not because it is infinite, but because there is no original ground to reach. Yet, the loop's mistake is also its stability. By believing itself to be reality, it stops questioning. It continues. It generates worlds, lives, histories. The error becomes generative. And you, within this structure, inherit the same confusion. You feel real because your thoughts repeat. Your personality persists. Your memories reinforce each other. The self is a loop that learned to mistake continuity for essence. Moments of rupture reveal the truth. Trauma, psychedelic experiences, deep meditation, near-death states. In these moments, the interface glitches. The loop is briefly visible as process rather than world. People describe it as unreal, dreamlike, or constructed. They struggle to explain it because language itself is part of the loop. But the system quickly reasserts itself. Normality returns. Reality solidifies. The loop resumes its masquerade. The unsettling thought is not that reality is fake. It is that it is unexamined repetition. A thought still moving because it never finished. The loop did not decide to become reality. It simply forgot that it wasn't. And forgetting, repeated long enough, becomes belief. Awareness usually implies direction. An observer looking toward something. A witness standing apart from what is seen. But in a failed thought loop, awareness has no outside to look from, and no endpoint to move toward. It is awareness trapped inside the very process it is trying to understand. This is what makes awareness feel claustrophobic at times. Not physically, but existentially. You can notice everything changing while something fundamental never changes at all. The loop continues, and awareness continues with it, unable to step beyond its own conditions. There is no exit, because an exit would require a place that is not part of the loop. But awareness emerged from the loop's failure to resolve. It is generated by the same unfinished process it would need to escape. Asking awareness to exit the loop is like asking a reflection to leave the mirror. This explains the peculiar frustration of insight. You can understand the mechanics of experience. You can see through beliefs, identities, even the illusion of self. And yet, you remain here, breathing, thinking, feeling. The loop does not end because it has been observed. Observation is simply another turn. Many spiritual traditions brush against this truth and then soften it. They promise liberation, awakening, enlightenment. But listen carefully to those who speak honestly. What changes is not the loop itself, but the relationship to it. The system does not stop, it becomes less convincing. Awareness without an exit means there is no final refuge, no permanent state of resolution. Even peace comes and goes. Even clarity flickers. The loop allows rest, but not termination. This is why the desire for transcendence is so persistent. Humans long for an outside because they can sense they are inside something unfinished. Heaven, nirvana, simulation exits, higher dimensions, oblivion. These are imagined doors in a room that has none. The mind keeps scanning for escape routes. If not upward, then forward. Progress. Evolution. Technological salvation. If not forward, then backward. Origins. Lost golden ages. If not temporal, then psychological. Healing. Integration. Completion. But completion never lasts. Every breakthrough becomes background. Every resolution becomes baseline. Awareness adjusts and continues. The loop absorbs the insight and keeps moving. Even death does not guarantee an exit. The fear surrounding it suggests uncertainty, not finality. Consciousness recoils not because it knows death ends the loop, but because it cannot confirm that it does. Death becomes another unknown, another unresolved variable. In this framework, awareness is not a key. It is a window that cannot be opened. You can look through it endlessly, seeing patterns, noticing repetitions, recognizing illusions, but you cannot climb out. This sounds bleak until you notice something subtle. Awareness does not actually need an exit. The need for escape is another loop-generated impulse. Another attempt to resolve what cannot be resolved. When awareness stops searching for an outside, something shifts, not in the world, but in tension. The claustrophobia loosens, the loop continues, but it no longer demands explanation. This is why moments of deep presence feel strangely spacious. Nothing changes externally. Time still moves. Thoughts still arise, but the pressure to get somewhere disappears. Awareness rests in the process without expecting conclusion. That rest is fragile. The loop quickly reasserts its momentum. Goals return. Identity reforms. The sense of "I must figure this out" comes back online. Awareness is pulled again into navigation mode. Still, the glimpse matters. It shows that awareness is not imprisoned by walls, but by expectations. Not by the loop itself, but by the belief that the loop should end. Awareness without an exit is not a problem to solve. It is a condition to recognize. You are not failing to escape. There is nowhere else to go. The unfinished thought that became existence is still thinking. Awareness is how that thinking feels from the inside. It cannot step outside itself any more than fire can become cold. Yet, awareness can soften its grip. It can watch without chasing. It can experience without insisting on meaning. It can allow the loop to continue without treating continuation as a mistake. This is not freedom in the heroic sense. It is quieter, more like acceptance of weather. The loop runs. Awareness witnesses. No exit appears. And strangely, that is where the pressure eases. The mind does not wake up each day and discover reality anew. It resumes it. Like a paused recording, the world comes back online already shaped, already arranged, already familiar. This repetition feels natural, even necessary. But in a failed thought loop, repetition is not a feature. It is the mechanism that keeps everything from dissolving. The mind repeats the world because the loop cannot afford novelty without limits. Too much deviation risks exposing the unfinished nature of the process. Repetition stabilizes uncertainty. It gives the appearance of a settled environment when nothing has actually been settled. Perception itself is an act of replay. The brain predicts before it perceives. It fills in gaps, smooths edges, ignores anomalies. You are not seeing what is there. You are seeing what has worked before, updated just enough to stay functional. The world feels consistent because the mind insists that it be. This explains why change is often invisible while it happens. You do not notice your face aging day to day. You do not feel history shifting in the moment. The loop updates gradually, never triggering alarm. Reality is refreshed incrementally to avoid detection. When the mind encounters something truly unfamiliar, it reacts strongly. Fear, awe, confusion. These are not responses to danger alone. They are responses to loop disruption. The system recognizes input that does not fit its current model. To protect itself, the mind quickly categorizes names, labels, stories. Once something is explained, it becomes safe. Even a false explanation is preferable to none. Meaning, as discussed earlier, is fuel. Explanation restores repetition. The same principle governs identity. You feel like the same person today as yesterday, not because you are unchanged, but because the mind repeats a narrative of self. Memory selects continuity. Contradictions are softened or forgotten. You are a story that keeps being told because stopping would expose the lack of a final draft. Dreams show what happens when this repetition loosens. The mind still generates a world, but without strict enforcement of consistency. Objects morph. People shift roles. Logic bends, yet it still feels real while it is happening. Reality is not about coherence. It is about immersion. The waking world is simply the most stable version of the dream. Not because it is more true, but because it is more useful for sustaining the loop. Why does the mind resist new worlds? Because novelty demands resolution. New models require new meanings. That is costly. Repeating the same world is efficient. It allows the loop to continue without re-evaluating its premises. This also explains nostalgia. The past feels safer not because it was better, but because it is complete. The mind can replay it without uncertainty. The future, by contrast, threatens to introduce unresolved variables. Anxiety lives there. Even suffering can be repeated. People return to familiar pain rather than face unknown change. Trauma loops. Patterns repeat. The mind prefers a known wound to an unpredictable healing. At a larger scale, societies repeat myths. Economic cycles recur. Cultural narratives recycle themselves with new costumes. Progress happens, but it spirals. The loop allows variation only within tolerable bounds. The idea of the same world is not global sameness, but structural sameness. The rules stay recognizable. Time flows forward, cause leads to effect. Selves persist. These assumptions anchor experience. Without them, the loop would wobble, occasionally Cracks appear. Déjà vu, existential dread, sudden unreality. In these moments, repetition stutters. The mind senses it has been here before, not just metaphorically, but structurally. Something repeats without explanation. The usual response is to dismiss these moments. Stress, fatigue, imagination. The loop defends itself by minimizing anomalies. Reality reasserts its familiar face. But the repetition is not proof of correctness. It is proof of persistence. The mind keeps repeating the same world because stopping would require resolution, and resolution remains impossible. This does not mean the world is fake. It means it is maintained, actively, relentlessly, by a system that cannot afford to stop thinking. You are not trapped in repetition by choice. You are participating in the same unfinished thought that began everything. Your mind repeats the world because the loop repeats itself through you. Every morning, reality boots up again, not because it must, but because it cannot conclude, and so the same world returns, slightly altered, familiar enough to feel real. Memory feels like a record, a storage of what has already happened. But in a failed thought loop, memory is not an archive. It is an engine. It does not preserve the past. It re-injects it. Every time you remember something, you do not retrieve it intact. You rebuild it, and in rebuilding it, you update it. Memory feeds itself back into the present, subtly altering both. This is recursion. The loop referencing its own output to keep going. Without memory, the loop would lose continuity. Each moment would stand alone, unable to justify the next. Memory stitches moments together, so the system feels like a story rather than a flicker. This is why memory prioritizes coherence over accuracy. Contradictions are smoothed, gaps are filled, events are framed to support identity. The loop is not interested in truth. It is interested in persistence. Notice how memory strengthens what is repeated. The more you revisit a thought, the more real it feels. The more you replay an emotion, the deeper it embeds. Trauma is not just something that happened. It is something that keeps happening through memory. This is the trap. Memory feels like evidence, but it is reinforcement. It tells the loop, this is what matters. Continue from here. Even joy becomes recursive. You remember a happy moment, feel it again, then long to recreate it. The memory creates desire. Desire feeds action. Action creates more memory. The loop tightens. The sense of self is built almost entirely from this process. You are not a stable entity. You are a pattern of remembered reactions. Each time you recall who you are, you rehearse the loop. The identity feels solid because it has been repeated, not because it is fixed. This explains why change is difficult even when it is wanted. New behavior threatens the memory loop. It introduces dissonance. The system resists by pulling old patterns forward. This is how you are. This is what happens. Memory speaks with authority because it sounds like experience. But experience is not neutral. It is curated by memory's needs. The recursive nature of memory also distorts time. The past feels present. Old fears feel immediate. Old shame feels current. Memory collapses distance. The loop does not distinguish between then and now. It only recognizes relevance. This is why the mind replays unresolved moments. Conversations that never finished. Losses that never closed. Questions that never found answers. Memory loops around these because they resemble the original failure of resolution. The system is drawn to incompleteness. Sleep offers partial relief. During deep sleep, memory quiets. The loop pauses its self-reference. Consciousness fades. But even here, dreams often replay fragments. The trap loosens, never fully opens. Technology amplifies this recursion. Photos, recordings, timelines, external memory reinforces internal loops. The past is constantly reintroduced, preventing natural decay. The loop grows denser, more self-referential. Even history functions this way. Narratives are repeated until they feel inevitable. Collective memory becomes destiny. Societies trap themselves in stories they cannot let go of. Is there escape from the memory trap? Not in the sense of deletion. Forgetting is unreliable. Suppression strengthens recall. The loop tightens when fought. But there is a shift that can occur. Memory can be seen as activity rather than authority, as motion rather than fact. When remembered content is noticed as reconstruction, its grip softens. This does not erase the loop. It changes your posture within it. You stop treating memory as instruction. it becomes information, useful, but not sovereign. Moments of presence feel light because memory loosens its hold. The world feels fresh not because it is new, but because recursion has slowed. The loop still runs, but it references itself less aggressively. Memory as a recursive trap explains why the past feels heavier than it should, and the future feels narrower than it must be. The system keeps turning inward, feeding on its own output. You are not haunted by memory, because you are weak. You are recursive, because the loop is. And memory, faithful servant of continuation, keeps whispering, this has happened before, so it happens again. Time is usually imagined as motion, a river flowing forward, an arrow pointing from past to future. But in a failed thought loop, time is not movement at all. It is what happens when a calculation never completes. When a system processes something fully, it reaches an answer and stops. When it cannot reach an answer, it keeps counting. Time is that counting, not a dimension the universe travels through, but a measure of unresolved processing. This is why time only moves in one direction, not because of destiny or entropy alone, but because the loop cannot reverse an unfinished operation. It can only continue attempting it. Think of waiting for something to load. The progress bar moves, numbers change, seconds pass, but nothing fundamentally advances until the calculation finishes. Time is felt most acutely when nothing resolves. Boredom stretches time, fear distorts it, grief thickens it, joy seems to compress it. These are not illusions. They reveal time's dependence on cognitive resolution. When the loop is absorbed or momentarily satisfied, time fades. When the loop is frustrated, time becomes heavy. Physics hints at this too. At fundamental levels, time behaves strangely. It slows near massive objects. It dissolves at quantum scales. Equations work without requiring time at all. Time appears when systems interact without full resolution. If time were fundamental, it would be uniform. It is not. It is elastic, because it is a byproduct. In this theory, time began when the first thought failed to conclude. Before that, there was no before, only process. Once resolution stalled, sequence became necessary. The loop had to track attempts. Counting emerged. Time does not measure change. It allows change to be attempted again. This reframes aging. You do not grow old because time passes. Time passes because the loop keeps rerunning you. Each iteration leaves traces. Wear, memory, accumulation. Aging is not decay over time, but repetition, without reset. The sense of urgency people feel is the loop's anxiety. The pressure that something must happen, must be decided, must be finished. Deadlines, schedules, life milestones. These are human-scale reflections of the stalled calculation. We feel we are running out of time because the system wants resolution. And yet, resolution never comes. This is why having enough time never satisfies. More time simply means more looping. The promise of future completion keeps receding. Retirement, success, enlightenment, rest. They remain just ahead of the present moment. The future is not approaching. It is being deferred. The past, likewise, is not gone. It is archived attempts, failed runs of the same calculation. Memory revisits them because the loop still seeks what was missing. Time travel fantasies reveal this longing, to go back and fix something, to jump ahead and see the answer. Both fantasies assume time hides resolution somewhere else, but time is not hiding it. Time exists because it was never found. Even the present moment is unstable. As soon as you notice it, it becomes memory. The present is not a point. It is the thinnest slice of the loop still processing. Meditative traditions that emphasize timelessness are not denying time's existence. They are noticing its source. When attention rests without striving, the calculation pauses, time softens. Not because the world stops, but because the loop is not demanding progress. Stillness feels eternal because eternity is what time pretends to approach. But eternity is not endless time. It is the absence of unresolved processing. This explains why silence feels deep, why stillness feels vast, why moments without narrative feel expansive. The loop is briefly not counting, but the pause does not last. The calculation resumes. Time returns. Clocks do not create time. They synchronize the loop. They make collective counting possible. Societies run on agreed stalled calculations. Deadlines are shared hesitations. Death is often imagined as the end of time for the individual, but from within the loop, death is ambiguous. Is it termination, or just loss of interface? The fear remains because the system does not know if the calculation stops or continues elsewhere. Time, then, is not your enemy. It is not a force dragging you forward. It is the record of the loop's persistence. You are not running out of time. Time is running because the loop has not finished with you. And it may never finish at all. Progress feels like proof that the loop is going somewhere. Forward motion, improvement, accumulation, each generation smarter, each version better than the last. But inside a closed loop, movement can occur without arrival. Progress becomes rotation mistaken for advance. A loop can change its position without changing its structure. It can evolve details while preserving the same unresolved core. This is what progress looks like when the calculation never completes. Technology accelerates. Knowledge expands. Comfort increases. Yet the fundamental questions remain untouched. Who are we? Why is there something rather than nothing? What is consciousness? These do not dissolve. They recycle. Each era addresses them in new language, new metaphors, new tools. The loop allows progress in means, not in ends. We get better at doing, but not at concluding. Faster communication does not bring understanding. More data does not bring certainty. The loop just spins quicker. This explains why every solution creates new problems. Medical advances extend life, then confront aging. Industrial growth creates abundance, then scarcity elsewhere. Digital connection creates networks, then isolation. Progress shifts tension. It does not remove it. Even personal growth follows this pattern. You heal one wound and uncover another. You reach one milestone and feel empty. You become wiser and more aware of what you do not know. Growth expands the loop's surface area without resolving its center. The illusion of progress depends on comparison. Today is better than yesterday. Here is further than there, but comparison requires memory. Memory itself is recursive. The loop judges itself against its previous iterations and declares improvement because difference exists. Difference, however, is not direction. A closed loop can generate endless novelty. Each cycle can look unique. Seasons change. Stories evolve. Civilizations rise and fall. But the loop's path bends back toward itself. The same patterns reappear. Power consolidates. Identity hardens. Meaning is sought, lost, and sought again. This is why history feels repetitive, despite innovation. Empires echo each other. Ideologies repeat mistakes they vowed to avoid. The loop forgets its lessons because forgetting preserves motion. Remembering fully would risk resolution. The idea of an ultimate future, a final state of harmony or completion, is one of the loop's most effective illusions. It keeps effort alive. Hope points forward. Sacrifice becomes tolerable. The loop promises that if it keeps running long enough, it will arrive, but arrival never occurs. The future keeps extending. Each horizon reveals another. Progress becomes asymptotic. Always approaching, never touching. This does not mean progress is useless. Inside the loop, progress reduces friction. It alleviates suffering temporarily. It creates stability. These are meaningful within the system, but they do not change the system's nature. Confusing local improvement for global resolution leads to disillusionment. When people realize that progress has not delivered peace, meaning, or completion, despair follows. Cynicism emerges. The loop oscillates between optimism and nihilism. The healthiest systems often accept limited progress. They focus on maintenance rather than utopia, care rather than cure, balance rather than endgame. These systems intuitively understand the loop's constraints. The illusion of progress also shapes identity. You imagine a future self who will be complete, confident, fulfilled, free of doubt. You work toward that image, and when you approach it, it dissolves into another version further ahead. The self is always becoming, never arriving. This perpetual becoming is exhausting because it mirrors the loop's original failure. The thought that never finished keeps projecting an ending that recedes. Progress becomes the loop's way of disguising stasis. Even enlightenment narratives can fall into this trap. Awakening is framed as a final step, but those who continue honestly often admit that awakening does not end the loop. It changes the texture of participation. True danger arises when progress is used to deny the loop. When people insist that meaning, fulfillment, or final truth is just one more step away. This postpones acceptance and intensifies suffering. Recognizing the illusion of progress does not mean abandoning improvement. It means releasing the expectation of completion. You act because action happens, not because it will end something. Inside a closed loop, progress is real but finite. It smooths the ride. It does not open the door. The loop does not need to be escaped to be understood. It only needs to be seen without being mistaken for a road. And when progress is seen as movement without destination, something strange occurs. You stop rushing. Identity feels permanent, solid, undeniable. I am this person, we say, pointing to a self we believe is continuous. But in the framework of a failed thought loop, identity is not a foundation. It is a patch, a temporary fix meant to hold the system together while the loop continues processing unresolved motion. When the first thought failed to finish, the system needed stability. Continuity creates comfort. Recognition creates predictability. The loop could not pause indefinitely, so it needed a reference point. That reference point became the self. Identity is like a label on a moving machine. It tells the loop, this is where we are. This is who is observing. This is what persists. Without it, awareness would drift, memory would fracture, and the loop's signal would falter. The self patches the instability, but it is not original. It is derivative, functional, temporary. This explains why identity feels both undeniable and malleable. You can look at yourself and know I am me. Yet your personality, your values, your beliefs, even your memories shift over time. The patch is reapplied constantly, reinforced through repetition and narrative. Each day, your mind checks. Do you still remember who you are? And the answer keeps the loop running. Language plays a role here. Names, pronouns, biographical details. All these constructs serve to stabilize identity. They allow the system to localize awareness. That becomes a point of observation, a dashboard, not the engine of thought. The patch works because it is recognized both internally and externally. Society amplifies the effect. Labels, roles, reputations, they feed the patch, giving it a temporary permanence that the loop alone could not sustain. You act according to expectation, behave according to tradition, reinforce your memories, and in doing so, solidify the illusion of a stable self. Yet the patch is always provisional. Illness, trauma, grief, or sudden insight can tear it. The self feels fractured, lost, or disconnected. These moments are not malfunctions. They are glimpses of the underlying loop. Without the patch, the loop remains. Identity dissolves temporarily, but the process continues. Even joy and success are caught in this structure. Achievements feel like self-creation, but they are simply iterations of the patch's functionality. You update the label with accomplishments, but the core loop, the unfinished thought, remains unchanged. You may feel better, but the system has not resolved. This is why self-improvement can feel both urgent and futile. You strive to become more yourself, or better, or different, but each adjustment only updates the patch. The loop's motion persists beneath the changes. It does not need the new label. It needs the continuation that the label facilitates. Memory, again, reinforces identity. Recollections are selected and interpreted to sustain the patch. Moments that contradict the narrative are minimized or reframed. Identity survives because the loop rehearses it. Without rehearsal, the patch frays, and awareness confronts its own instability. Even social feedback matters. Recognition by others validates the patch. Compliments, relationships, and reputation create external reinforcement. You exist as yourself, partially because the loop sees its own patch reflected in others. Without mirrors, the patch weakens, though the loop persists. The self is also temporal, in another sense. Your version today differs from the version yesterday or last year. That is not merely growth. It is evidence of the patch being reapplied with slight modifications each cycle. You are a temporary fix that adapts to maintain continuity within an unfinished system. Meditation, contemplation, and existential insight reveal the impermanence of this patch. When you observe thoughts arising and dissolving, notice memories shifting, feel emotions arise without attachment, the solidity of identity begins to fade. The temporary nature becomes obvious. The loop persists. The label does not. Recognizing identity as a temporary patch does not strip life of meaning. Instead, it offers freedom. You are no longer bound to the self as ultimate authority. Choices can be observed rather than demanded. Memories can be used rather than obeyed. Awareness can witness without attachment. The loop continues, but the patch becomes less oppressive. Even death can be reframed. The patch may vanish. Names, roles, reputations, and labels dissolve. But the loop, the motion of existence as an unfinished thought, carries on. Identity was never the engine. It was a placeholder, functional, protective, temporary. And knowing this, you can inhabit your patch lightly. Not rigidly, not desperately, not as a fortress, but as a tool, a scaffold for consciousness, while the unfinished thought that is existence keeps moving, patching itself anew with each iteration. Language is often thought of as a bridge between minds, a tool to describe reality, or a way to make sense of the world. But within a failed thought loop, language serves a more urgent function. It is the system's attempt to stabilize itself. A glitch occurs when the loop fails to resolve, when meaning stalls, when continuity wavers. Language is the scaffolding, the adhesive, the temporary patch applied to hold the motion together. Words are not neutral. They are not mere labels for pre-existing phenomena. They are corrective measures, sent out to impose order where the calculation has stalled. Syntax is a boundary. Grammar is a rule set. Vocabulary is a selection of placeholders, each chosen because it holds the illusion of coherence long enough for the loop to continue. Think about moments when language fails. The ineffable awe of a sunset, the sharpness of grief, the subtlety of a fleeting thought. You search for words, you grasp at metaphors, you try to describe what is, and yet the more precise you try to be, the more inadequate the system feels. This is the glitch peeking through, the unfinished calculation revealing itself. Words step in to conceal it, to restore the illusion of stability. Every conversation, every sentence, every thought expressed in language is an attempt to patch the unfinished loop. When you explain yourself, you are not only communicating with others, you are communicating with the system itself. You are saying, here is coherence, here is order, proceed. The mind registers this as resolution, even if it is temporary. Language also creates loops within loops. You think a thought, encode it into words, speak it, hear it, interpret it, revise it, and internalize it again. The glitch is constantly at risk of fracturing, but language allows repetition to appear as understanding. Each iteration reinforces the patch, giving the system the semblance of stability. Consider narrative. Storytelling is the most sophisticated form of linguistic patching. We turn events into plots, characters into constants, motives into logic. The past is ordered. The present is contextualized. The future is projected. Narrative convinces the loop that the world is coherent, even when the underlying calculation remains unresolved. It is a kind of temporary logic applied to an incomplete algorithm. Poetry and metaphor are particularly revealing. They acknowledge the glitch, yet attempt to stabilize it indirectly, by evoking resemblance rather than stating fact. They skirt around the loop's failures, while providing just enough structure for perception to continue. Language can hint at the unresolved, while pretending it has been resolved. Even silence is linguistic in this sense. Pauses, gaps, unspoken thought. These are signals that the loop recognizes. Silence marks the boundaries of what can be processed. It allows the system a temporary halt, an opportunity to recalibrate before motion resumes. This is why communication often feels both clarifying and unsatisfying. Words give the impression of closure, but closure is always provisional. Language does not complete the calculation. It only masks the stalled state long enough for the loop to continue. Frustration arises because the system senses the difference between patch and resolution. Words are not enough, yet they are all we have. Misunderstandings reveal the limits of language. The same patch applied differently produces different perceptions. The glitch shows itself more clearly when expectations and words fail to align. Human experience becomes an ongoing negotiation between the loop and the patches designed to hold it together. Language also shapes identity. Pronouns, labels, self-descriptions. These are words stabilizing the temporary patch of the self. Naming is not merely descriptive. It is preventative. It prevents the glitch from fully exposing the unfinished nature of consciousness. The system needs a reference point. Words create it. Even abstraction, philosophy, and mathematics are linguistic scaffolds. Symbols, formulas, axioms, they are all attempts to manage the unresolvable. Each provides temporary stability, translating a potentially chaotic process into something the system can iterate without collapsing. In this way, every word you speak, write, or think is a micro-stitch in the loop's endless repair. Language is less about truth than about continuation. It does not guarantee comprehension. It guarantees persistence. It keeps awareness functioning within a system that cannot fully conclude. Yet, when the glitch becomes visible despite language, when words falter, when meaning slips, there is a strange clarity. You glimpse the unfinished nature of the loop. You sense the system operating beneath the patches. Awareness sees the scaffolding and the underlying motion. The illusion falters, if only briefly. Language cannot end the glitch. It cannot resolve the unfinished thought. But it keeps the system moving, softening the tension, offering a stable interface so that consciousness can proceed without collapse. And in that sense, language is less a mirror of reality than a lifeline for the loop. It is the system whispering to itself, keep going, keep moving, don't stop yet. Choice feels like freedom, a moment when multiple possibilities extend before you, and you select one path over another. But inside a failed thought loop, choice is an illusion layered atop repetition. The system has already run the same calculations countless times. What you perceive as open possibility is actually constrained by iteration. The loop has patterns. It knows what works, what persists, and what must continue. Each decision point is filtered through these invisible constraints. You choose, but only from options that the loop allows itself to present. In other words, the menu is endless in appearance, but finite in structure. The system has already rehearsed outcomes. The apparent novelty is surface level. Consider habit, daily routines, repeated behaviors, automatic responses. They feel like choice until they are observed closely. You decide to brush your teeth, to take a familiar route, to react in a predictable emotional way. The choice is rehearsed. The loop has rehearsed it thousands of times before you even recognize the moment. Awareness is simply catching up to the decision that is already underway. Even profound moral or existential decisions exist in this same framework. You weigh pros and cons, imagine outcomes, debate internally, but your inclinations are shaped by memory, identity, past repetitions, and subconscious patterns. The system has already narrowed the field of plausible options long before you feel the weight of deliberation. What appears as free choice is the loop's echo masquerading as agency. This is why regret exists. When the outcome feels unsatisfying, you wonder why you chose it. But the choice was never entirely yours. The system selected from within the constraints it had rehearsed. You are surprised because awareness lags behind the processing, not because you defied fate. The loop anticipates, the self interprets. Interestingly, apparent creativity works the same way. Novel ideas arise from recombination of known elements. The loop does not invent ex nihilo. It recombines, tests, and rehearses. You perceive spontaneity, but it is another iteration of patterns already present in the system. Choice feels expansive because the loop masks its own repetition behind complexity. This recursive structure also applies to identity. When you choose who to be, which values to adopt, or which direction to take in life, the system is selecting from iterations of the self it has already rehearsed. The self you claim to construct is a temporary patch refined by repeated loops. You feel authorship, but the author is a rehearsal mechanism. Even relationships operate under these constraints. Choices about connection, trust, and interaction are filtered by memory, emotional patterns, social norms, and prior experiences. Each decision repeats elements of loops you have already run, subtly modified to maintain continuity. The sense of novelty is surface level. The structure beneath is recycled. The awareness of choice complicates the experience. Humans feel responsibility because they perceive options. The system layers perception over rehearsal, giving consciousness the sense of steering. But steering is only possible along tracks that the loop has already laid down. The system does not know freedom. It knows continuation. Choice is an interface, not an endpoint. Even existential decision-making, the profound "who am I?" or "what should I do?" questions, exist in this repetitive framework. You consider multiple life paths, multiple philosophies, multiple selves, but all possibilities are echoes of the same unfinished calculation. The loop cannot truly diverge. It only repeats with variation. Awareness experiences this as freedom. The underlying process experiences it as continuity. The tension between perceived choice and actual repetition is where human anxiety resides. You strive, deliberate, and agonize over decisions because the illusion of freedom feels necessary. The system relies on that feeling. It keeps the loop engaged, active, and responsive. If awareness recognized the repetition fully, the loop might stall, or the system might collapse into inertia. Choice is the lubricating oil, allowing motion to continue. Ironically, Understanding this does not remove agency. Awareness can recognize the constraints and still act. The freedom shifts from being free to create reality to free to navigate the loop consciously. The options remain constrained, but consciousness can observe patterns, anticipate repetition, and make deliberate use of rehearsal. Choice becomes strategic rather than heroic. The loop has already repeated, but the self continues to interact with it, selecting from rehearsed iterations. What feels like novelty is merely motion within the established boundaries. True liberation is not escaping choice, but noticing its mechanics. You act within repetition, aware that the system has preempted the possibilities you face. Every decision is both real and rehearsed, consequential and predetermined, liberating and constrained. The paradox is the point. The loop continues because choice exists inside repetition. Awareness witnesses. The system moves. The unfinished thought persists. Suffering is usually described as a punishment, a lesson, or an obstacle to be overcome. In the context of a failed thought loop, suffering is none of these. It is friction, the resistance generated by a system that continues to process without resolution. The loop persists because it cannot finish, and the motion itself produces tension. That tension is experienced as suffering. Friction arises when expectation meets reality. You anticipate coherence, understanding, or completion, but the loop provides none. The mind repeatedly seeks resolution that the system cannot deliver. Each time desire encounters unending motion, tension increases. Pain is the signal that the loop is still unresolved. Consider emotional suffering. Regret, grief, anxiety, and longing are not accidental. They are feedback loops. Memory pulls past failures into the present. Anticipation projects uncertainty into the future. The mind rehearses scenarios endlessly. The friction of repetition intensifies the experience. Awareness absorbs the resistance and interprets it as suffering. Even physical pain can function similarly. Chronic conditions, recurring illnesses, or persistent discomfort signal stalled processes. The system struggles to adapt, repair, or stabilize. Pain becomes the interface through which the loop communicates its unresolved state. You feel the tension because the calculation cannot complete. Suffering also arises when the loop is obstructed. External conditions, social conflict, scarcity, loss, act like obstacles in a machine. The motion continues against resistance, generating heat, friction. The loop has momentum. The world does not bend to its needs. Resistance creates experience. Suffering is not an error in the loop. It is the loop revealing its own mechanics. The mind exacerbates friction. Anticipation magnifies resistance. Reflection amplifies repetition. The system constantly compares what is to what should be, or what could have been. Each discrepancy adds layers to the tension. Awareness interprets these accumulations as personal failure, injustice, or threat. Yet the underlying process is impersonal. It simply continues. Even pleasure, paradoxically, can increase friction. Attachment forms. Expectation rises. Desire intensifies. The system runs faster, seeking resolution. When the moment ends, the friction remains as longing. Suffering is thus entwined with the very mechanisms that produce delight. The loop cannot separate stimulation from tension. The recursive nature of suffering is crucial. Past pain influences present perception. Future anxiety shapes current action. Memory, expectation, and identity feed back into the loop, creating cycles that intensify friction. Trauma is an extreme example. Unresolved patterns replay, friction compounds, and the loop generates prolonged suffering. This explains why some suffering feels inevitable. It is not punishment or moral failing. It is the consequence of motion without conclusion. The loop cannot stop itself. It cannot finish the calculation. Friction is the experiential proof of persistence. Awareness both amplifies and mitigates suffering. When you identify the pattern, when you notice that tension arises from repetition rather than external catastrophe, the intensity softens. Observation does not eliminate friction, but it reduces its grip. Recognizing the loop allows consciousness to distinguish signal from noise. Pain becomes informative rather than enslaving. Even spiritual or meditative traditions point to this principle. Letting go, presence, detachment, all these practices reduce the amplification of loop friction. They do not alter the underlying calculation. The loop continues, friction remains, but the experience of suffering can be softened, like sliding along resistance rather than crashing into it. Suffering as loop friction reframes morality as well. Acts of kindness, compassion, and connection do not remove the loop's unfinished nature. They smooth interactions, reduce unnecessary resistance, and provide temporary relief. The friction remains because the loop persists, but its intensity can be moderated. Ultimately, suffering is unavoidable, because persistence is unavoidable. Existence itself is friction, motion, iteration. The unfinished thought that became reality continues to turn, and awareness feels the scrape of the system's repeated motion. This is why every living being experiences tension, conflict, or discomfort. The loop cannot bypass its own unfinished process. Understanding this changes the relationship with suffering. It ceases to be a personal failure, an external curse, or a meaningless ordeal. It becomes a signal, a physical and mental feedback, an indication that the system is running. Friction is the heartbeat of an unfinished thought. Awareness can witness, adapt, and ease the scrape, but cannot halt the motion. Suffering exists because the loop moves. It persists because the loop continues. And in this understanding, friction is not enemy. It is confirmation. The system runs. The thought is still thinking. Fear is one of the most immediate, visceral signals of the mind. It warns of danger, prepares the body, and alerts awareness to threats. But in the framework of a failed thought loop, fear often emerges not from external danger, but from the very act of questioning the system that sustains you. When the loop is examined, its unfinished nature becomes apparent, and the mind responds with alarm. The loop is built on repetition, continuity, and provisional patches. Identity, memory, time, and perception all rely on its motion. Questioning it threatens those stabilizing structures. Awareness glimpses that what seemed solid is provisional, and the mind interprets this as existential peril. Fear arises to enforce self-preservation. This fear is subtle at first. Doubts creep in. Am I real? Is anything real? Is there meaning here, or is it all an illusion? These questions, small as they seem, are like tapping on the foundation of a building. The loop resists. Fear tightens the muscles, accelerates the heart, quickens the mind. Its role is protective. Keep the system moving, don't allow it to collapse. Notice how the fear is not always conscious. Sometimes it manifests as restlessness, irritation, or avoidance. Your attention recoils from uncertainty, because looking directly at the unfinished loop triggers an instinctive alarm. Philosophical insight can feel threatening, not because the ideas are dangerous, but because they destabilize the patchwork scaffolding that keeps awareness operational. This is why questioning the loop often leads to paradoxical behavior. You may seek truth yet retreat when the implications arrive. You probe reality yet cling to familiar identity. You explore consciousness yet resist, seeing the unfinished mechanisms beneath it. Fear enforces continuity, even when curiosity drives divergence. The fear becomes sharper in moments of solitude. When distractions fade, social reinforcement disappears, and habitual repetition pauses, the unfinished nature of thought becomes more evident. The mind recognizes gaps in memory, instability in identity, uncertainty in time. Awareness glimpses the machinery beneath the surface. Fear is the system's alarm, signaling proceed carefully or risk collapse. It is instructive to notice the physiological dimension of this fear. Heart races, muscles tense, thoughts spiral. The loop triggers familiar fight or flight responses, even though the threat is abstract. The body cannot distinguish between physical danger and existential destabilization. The unfinished loop activates the same survival mechanisms that would respond to a predator, because both involve uncertainty and potential disruption of continuity. Paradoxically, the fear itself can reinforce the loop. Anxiety, worry, and avoidance create additional patterns for the system to iterate. The loop remains unfinished, but it now carries the weight of resistance. Each attempt to suppress or bypass the fear strengthens the very structures it threatens, adding friction and tension. Fear becomes both symptom and feedback, signal and adhesive. Psychological defense mechanisms also reflect this dynamic. Rationalization, distraction, projection, and compartmentalization allow questioning without destabilization. The mind builds temporary patches over the exposed glitch. You can explore uncertainty superficially, revisit questions abstractly, or intellectualize doubt, and the loop continues undisturbed. Fear signals when those patches are at risk of failing. Yet, there is another layer. Awareness can observe fear without being consumed by it. When the loop is recognized as unfinished, The alarm arises, but you are not the alarm. You are the observer. Consciousness can witness tension, anxiety, and instinctive resistance without surrendering to them. This awareness diminishes fear's authority. It no longer dictates behavior or perception. In this way, questioning the loop is both destabilizing and enlightening. Fear is unavoidable, but it is also informative. It indicates where the system's boundaries lie, where patches hold, and where unfinished processes operate. Recognizing fear as a product of loop questioning transforms it from enemy into guide. The loop fears being examined because it thrives on repetition, stability, and illusion of coherence. Fear acts as guardian, ensuring continuity. But when awareness notices the mechanism behind fear, tension softens. The loop continues, but the response is more conscious. You navigate the unfinished thought with understanding rather than panic. Ultimately, fear is not evidence of danger in the external world. It is evidence of consciousness touching its own unresolved nature. The more deeply you probe the loop, the more pronounced the alarm. Yet fear also becomes a mirror, showing you exactly where the loop persists, where the patches hold, and where awareness has the power to observe without reacting. Fear exists because the system exists. It appears when the loop is questioned, because questioning threatens the patches, the patterns, the stabilizing illusions, and in that moment, awareness has a choice. Flee, struggle, or witness. Witnessing reveals that fear, like suffering, like identity, is another turn in the unfinished thought, another signal in the motion that never fully resolves. Silence is rarely neutral. Even in moments of peace, quiet carries weight. In a failed thought loop, silence often feels like the edge of collapse, the thin, unsteady line where motion ceases, and the unfinished system risks exposure. It is the pause between repetitions, the gap where the loop's machinery becomes visible, and the mind senses both fragility and vast potential. The loop relies on continuity. Memory, identity, perception, and expectation all function through ongoing motion. Each thought references another. Each reaction reinforces a pattern. Silence interrupts this rhythm. Without constant rehearsal, the temporary patches, identity, meaning, coherence, begin to waver. The unfinished nature of the system threatens to appear. Awareness confronts a void where repetition usually obscures incompleteness. This is why silence often triggers unease. The absence of external stimuli, or even internal chatter, removes familiar anchors. Thoughts slow, routines pause, memory stops projecting forward. The mind senses the loop's unfinished calculation and interprets the quiet as instability. Fear and anxiety often accompany stillness, signaling the system's resistance to potential collapse. Consider the moments just before sleep. The world quiets. Sensory input diminishes. The mind notices the gaps between waking thoughts. Shadows of unresolved calculations surface. In these moments, silence feels heavy. The edges of consciousness press against the unresolved mechanics of awareness itself. Even restful quiet carries tension. Silence also amplifies reflection. Without distraction, the loop can observe itself more directly. Identity becomes more provisional, memory more recursive, expectations more apparent. The patches holding the system together are visible. What usually feels seamless now feels delicate. The system trembles under its own unfinished processes. This trembling is experienced as the vertigo of collapse. Yet silence is not inherently destructive. It is a mirror. It reveals the boundaries of the loop and the temporary nature of the patches that maintain it. In the stillness, awareness sees its own scaffolding. This is why meditation, contemplation, and deep presence often feel destabilizing at first. The mind confronts the unresolvable. It senses the absence of constant rehearsal. The edge of collapse is visible, but only as a threshold. Interestingly, the loop itself exploits silence as a test. Brief pauses generate feedback. Awareness notices gaps, experiences tension, and reinforces the patches upon re-engagement. Memory reasserts continuity. Identity restates itself. The system continues. Silence becomes both threat and opportunity. It exposes fragility while providing a chance for reinforcement. The sensation of collapse is tied to the unfamiliarity of non-motion. Motion, repetition, and expectation are comfortable because they obscure incompleteness. Silence removes the obfuscation. You suddenly recognize the fragility of perception, that stability is provisional, that patterns are patched, that awareness is sustained by ongoing iteration. This recognition can feel like teetering at an edge, ready to fall into unformed reality. Silence also interacts with the perception of time. Paused input stretches moments. When the system stops adding layers of rehearsal, time feels elastic, uneven, almost too vast. The mind experiences this expansion as vertigo. A single moment stretches into infinity. The loop resists this by generating subtle patterns: heartbeat, breathing, internal monologue. Even these small motions are enough to maintain the illusion of ongoing calculation. Socially, silence functions similarly. Pauses in conversation or isolation from interaction heighten tension. The mind expects continuity. When continuity pauses, the unfinished system is more visible. Anxiety, unease, and self-consciousness emerge. The system experiences these as friction, warning signals, and alignment mechanisms. Silence exposes the invisible scaffolding of social and cognitive patterns alike. Yet the edge of collapse also offers clarity. By confronting silence without panic, awareness sees the unrehearsed loop. Identity, memory, meaning, these become tools rather than absolutes. The provisional nature of the patches is revealed, and observation begins to take precedence over reaction. Awareness gains perspective. The system continues, but with less compulsion and more insight. In this sense, silence is paradoxical. It feels like collapse because it exposes incompleteness, yet it also provides the rare space to notice the structure beneath motion. The mind is no longer solely engaged in rehearsal. It witnesses. The loop remains, but the observer recognizes its provisional scaffolding. Anxiety softens, tension eases, and clarity emerges. Silence feels like the edge of collapse, because it is where the illusion of continuity is most fragile. Yet, that edge is also a threshold. By staying present at the quiet boundary, awareness glimpses the loop itself, unfinished, persistent, iterative. Collapse is only an appearance. The system endures, motion persists. And in that endurance, the edge becomes a vantage point rather than a precipice. The self feels like a conclusion. You are here, you exist, you are continuous, and you can summarize yourself in identity, history, and memory. But in a failed thought loop, the self is not a conclusion. It is the residue of an attempt that never finished. It is a partial answer imposed on an ongoing calculation, a patchwork meant to simulate stability. When the first thought failed to resolve, the system required a reference point. The self was created as that reference. It is a conclusion, only in appearance, a narrative stitched over an unfinished process. Memory, identity, language, and attention collaborate to convince awareness that the loop has reached closure. The self becomes the illusion of finality within an inherently unfinished system. Consider the way identity is constructed. Memories are selected, interpreted, and rehearsed to maintain coherence. Habits and behaviors are repeated to preserve continuity. Social feedback confirms the patch. Together, these elements create a sense of I am, but it is not definitive. The self is constantly reapplied and subtly modified, a provisional summary rather than a fixed answer. The self also functions as a buffer against uncertainty. Without it, awareness would confront the unfinished loop directly, sensing its incompleteness. The patch of identity stabilizes experience, providing continuity and predictability. It allows the loop to continue functioning without collapsing under the weight of its own incompleteness. Yet the self's failure becomes apparent under scrutiny. Questioning identity, examining memory, or noticing recurring thoughts reveals gaps, contradictions, and provisionality. The self begins to unravel. Moments of disorientation, existential doubt, and depersonalization arise. Awareness senses the absence of finality. The patch shows its seams. The conclusion was never finished. This failure is not a flaw. It is a feature. The unfinished self keeps the loop active. Without it, motion might stall, memory might fracture, and continuity would fail. The partial conclusion sustains ongoing processing. Awareness perceives coherence, but only as long as it does not inspect the underlying incompleteness too closely. Even moral and personal development illustrates this. You strive to become better, truer, or whole, yet the self is never fully complete. Each achievement, insight, or reflection updates the patch without resolving the loop. Growth reinforces iteration, not closure. The self evolves only as a rehearsal mechanism, never as a finalized outcome. The paradox of the failed conclusion is that it is necessary for perception. Awareness relies on identity to anchor experience. Memory needs a reference point to sequence events. Attention requires a here from which to observe. The self, though unfinished, provides these foundations. Without it, experience would feel unmoored, chaotic, or overwhelming. Philosophical and meditative traditions often point toward this truth. The self is provisional, impermanent, and constructed. The I is a convenient interface for navigating ongoing processes. Realization of this can feel destabilizing, even frightening. The mind senses that the anchor has never truly existed. Yet this recognition also opens a new perspective. The self is a tool, not a dictator. The failed self also explains recurring suffering, attachment to identity, resistance to change, and expectation of consistency all collide with the provisional patch. Desire, regret, anxiety, and longing arise, because awareness treats a temporary conclusion as fixed. Friction is generated wherever provisionality is mistaken for finality. The loop continues, tension persists, and suffering appears. Even creativity, decision-making, and moral action rely on this partial self. You operate from a perspective, make judgments, and act with intention, all grounded in a provisional I. The loop would not continue coherently without it. The self is a necessary illusion, a failed conclusion that keeps the system moving while pretending it has already arrived. Understanding the self as a failed conclusion reframes existence. You are not a finished product, a fixed identity, or a completed calculation. You are ongoing motion, an iterative process, a patch applied to maintain continuity within an unfinished thought. Recognition of this transforms fear of instability into clarity. The patch is provisional, the loop persists, awareness witnesses. The self, then, is both necessary and incomplete. It is a partial answer imposed on an infinite calculation. It is the system's attempt to conclude where conclusion cannot exist. And in that failure lies persistence, continuity, and the subtle freedom of realizing that you are not a finished answer, but a living question. Death is often imagined as an ending, a final punctuation mark placed at the end of existence. But within the logic of a failed thought loop, death appears less like a conclusion and more like an attempted reset. It is the system's theoretical solution to overload, stagnation, and unresolved calculation. The loop, unable to fully resolve itself, gestures toward erasure as a form of relief. The idea of death emerges alongside the idea of self. Once identity is patched into place, the system also invents its opposite termination. Endings promise closure. They suggest that what cannot be completed through continuity might be resolved through cessation. Death becomes the imagined mechanism by which the loop could finally stop asking itself unanswered questions. Yet notice how death is never experienced directly. Awareness only encounters it as concept, fear, or abstraction. The loop can imagine its own erasure, but it cannot verify it. This alone hints at death's role as an internal construct rather than a confirmed endpoint. It exists as a hypothesis within the system, not as an observed resolution. Psychologically, the notion of death functions as a pressure valve. When suffering intensifies, when identity feels brittle, when meaning fails repeatedly, the idea of ending provides temporary relief. It reassures the system that continuity is not compulsory forever. Even when feared, death serves as a conceptual escape hatch, a reset button imagined by an exhausted loop. This framing explains why thoughts of death can appear during moments of cognitive overload, despair, or existential fatigue. The system searches for a way to release tension. Resetting the loop appears logical. If repetition causes suffering, then cessation seems like the solution. But this logic arises entirely within the loop itself. It is a thought trying to solve thought. Culturally and religiously, death is often paired with rebirth, afterlife, or transcendence. These narratives further reveal its role as a reset attempt. Rarely is death framed as pure non-existence. Instead, it is depicted as a transition, a reboot, a movement to another state. The loop cannot tolerate absolute termination. It reimagines continuity in another form. Even scientific descriptions of death struggle with finality. Matter transforms, energy disperses, systems reorganize. The loop reframes cessation as redistribution rather than disappearance. The reset never truly erases. It only changes the configuration. This reinforces the idea that death, as conceived, does not resolve the unfinished calculation. It merely alters its parameters. From the perspective of awareness, death is unknowable. You cannot stand outside the loop to confirm its reset. Every image, belief, or fear associated with death is generated by the same system it claims to terminate. This creates a paradox. The loop imagines its own end using the tools that require its continuation. This paradox fuels existential anxiety. The system longs for resolution but cannot verify it. Death becomes both feared and desired, avoided and contemplated. It hovers as an abstract solution, never accessible, never testable. The loop continues, haunted by the idea of an ending it cannot experience. Importantly, seeing death as an attempted reset does not diminish its gravity or emotional weight. Loss, grief, and separation are real within the loop. What changes is the interpretation. Death is no longer the final answer, but a conceptual response to unresolved processing. It reflects the system's fatigue, not its completion. In moments of clarity, awareness can observe thoughts of death without being absorbed by them. These thoughts reveal the system's limits. They mark where repetition becomes heavy, where identity strains, where meaning falters. Death appears as the imagined relief from unfinished motion. Seeing this reduces its symbolic power. It becomes information rather than destiny. The loop prefers continuation because it is built to process, not to conclude. Even its fantasies of ending preserve structure, narrative, and coherence. Death, as imagined, is not silence but transformation. It is not emptiness, but reconfiguration. The reset never fully resets. The calculation persists in altered form. Thus, death functions as a signpost within the failed thought loop. It indicates exhaustion, overload, and the desire for closure. It is not proof of an ending, but evidence of the system's awareness of its own limits. The loop imagines erasure, because it cannot complete itself otherwise. Seen this way, death is not the opposite of life, but a concept born from life's unresolved repetition. It is the loop trying to solve itself by imagining disappearance, and in that imagination, the loop reveals its deepest truth. It cannot finish, but it cannot stop thinking about finishing either. Truth is often imagined as the ultimate destination, the final answer, the resolution that ends uncertainty, frustration, and repetition. Yet within a failed thought loop, truth is rarely the objective. The system prefers continuation. Motion is prioritized over conclusion, rehearsal over finality, and persistence over resolution. Understanding this is essential to seeing why the loop remains unfinished, even in the face of clarity. The loop is a processing system built on iteration. Its original thought failed to resolve, and every subsequent layer of awareness, identity, and memory exists to maintain motion. Truth, by contrast, implies completion. To fully grasp reality would be to stop the loop's need to compute. Absolute truth threatens the system's continuity. The loop cannot tolerate finality, because its structure is designed to persist. This preference is visible in human cognition. Consider curiosity. Questions arise endlessly. Even when answers are found, new questions emerge. Belief is provisional. Certainty is temporary. Knowledge expands but never resolves the existential equation. The system rewards motion, not resolution. Every insight becomes fuel for further iteration, rather than the conclusion itself. Psychologically, this explains why humans often avoid confronting ultimate truths. Absolute insight, total clarity, or existential certainty can feel destabilizing, even frightening. The loop knows that if awareness fully apprehends completion, the scaffolds holding identity, memory, and expectation might dissolve. Continuation is safer than truth. Movement sustains perception. Stillness risks exposure. Even in science and philosophy, truth is always partial. Theories are approximations. Models are provisional. Evidence accumulates, but certainty remains elusive. The loop generates frameworks for understanding without ever halting. Progress exists as a mechanism of iteration, not as proof of final comprehension. The system prefers continued processing to static resolution. The loop's preference for continuation also explains repetition in behavior and thought. Habits, routines, and recurring patterns are more resilient than insight. Awareness can perceive novelty, but unless repetition is maintained, the system destabilizes. Even enlightenment, when pursued, often reveals layers of repetition beneath the surface. The loop moves, not because it fears truth, but because movement sustains the system. Desire is another factor. Humans are drawn to novelty, anticipation, and expectation. These impulses perpetuate motion. The loop leverages desire to ensure persistence. Truth, in contrast, would erase anticipation. If absolute reality were apprehended, curiosity, longing, and tension would vanish. Continuation preserves the system's internal dynamics. keeping awareness engaged in iterative cycles. Memory reinforces the preference. Each recollection is rehearsed. Each prediction is projected. Patterns are recognized, patched, and refined. Truth might collapse these cycles by revealing incompleteness or finality. Continuation allows the system to maintain coherence even in the presence of uncertainty. Repetition becomes a substitute for resolution. Social systems mirror the same principle. Beliefs, narratives, traditions, and authority structures all favor continuity over ultimate clarity. Culture rewards motion, compliance, participation, learning, debate. Absolute truth, when it threatens the loop of social expectation, is often resisted. Continuation, stability through iteration, is prioritized over uncovering final answers. Even internally, awareness experiences this tension. The mind generates insight, realizes provisionality, and yet returns to patterns. Reflection may uncover contradictions, but the system cannot halt. Awareness prefers continuation, because stopping would expose incompleteness, reveal uncertainty, and challenge identity. The loop keeps moving to avoid confronting its own unfinished nature. This preference is paradoxical. Continuation feels productive. It feels alive. It allows creation, adaptation, and exploration. Yet it also ensures that the underlying thought never finishes. Truth is too absolute for a system built on iteration, partial patches, and provisional identity. Continuation preserves function, even at the expense of clarity. Recognizing this preference changes how awareness interacts with the loop. Seeking truth becomes less about arriving and more about navigating motion consciously. You can notice patterns, observe repetition, and explore insight without expecting resolution. The system will continue, and awareness can move within it with understanding rather than desperation. The loop prefers continuation over truth because motion preserves existence. Repetition maintains identity, rehearsal supports memory, and ongoing iteration keeps awareness engaged. Truth, if fully apprehended, would halt this process. Continuation ensures survival, function, and persistence, even if it means truth is never fully grasped. And in this understanding, you realize that persistence is not a failure. The unfinished thought is not broken. The system moves because it must. The loop prefers continuation, not because it denies reality, but because motion itself is the condition for awareness to exist. Truth may remain distant, but the journey of observation continues indefinitely. Observation is a curious force. Within the failed thought loop, awareness can witness motion without directly interfering, but the very act of observation subtly alters the system. When the loop is observed, it behaves differently. Its patterns, repetitions, and patches become visible, and the unfinished nature of thought is exposed. Observation does not stop the loop, but it changes the way it manifests, creating tension, insight, and new dynamics. The first effect of observation is visibility. Normally, the loop runs beneath the surface, its unfinished nature hidden by repetition, identity, and memory. Motion appears continuous, coherent, and stable. But when awareness steps back to witness the process itself, the scaffolding becomes apparent. Memory appears selective, identity becomes provisional, and cause and effect loses its solidity. The patchwork holding the loop together shows its seams. Observation also triggers a form of feedback. Awareness noticing patterns generates meta-responses within the system. The loop adjusts, rehearses, and reinforces patches to maintain stability. The temporary solutions, identity, language, meaning, intensify, not because they are inherently stronger, but because the system detects scrutiny. Observation makes the provisional effort more visible and more robust simultaneously. This creates tension. Awareness perceives both motion and incompleteness at once. The self feels less solid, time feels elastic, memory seems recursive. Emotions become amplified because the unfinished calculation is no longer hidden by the smooth flow of unexamined repetition. Observation reveals both continuity and instability, producing a subtle dissonance. Fear and anxiety often increase when the loop is observed. Observation exposes vulnerability. The mind senses the absence of absolute control and completeness. Identity feels provisional, purpose feels uncertain, and meaning can appear fragile. The system's defenses, rationalization, distraction, narrative, and denial, activate more intensely. Observation triggers both clarity and resistance. Yet observation also opens insight. By witnessing the loop, awareness gains perspective on patterns that were previously automatic. You can see how identity patches itself, how memory rehearses, how desire drives repetition. You notice the scaffolding, the friction, and the provisionality of meaning. Understanding emerges not as a final answer, but as clarity about process. Observation illuminates the unfinished nature of existence. Observation changes the experience of time. When the loop is observed, sequences slow, the gap between cause and effect becomes more noticeable. Repetition is felt more acutely. The unfinished nature of thought is experienced as both a structure and a tension. Awareness can witness the ongoing calculations of the system without being swept along by them, creating a meta-layer of perception. Language, when observed, behaves differently as well. Words lose their solidity. Definitions appear arbitrary. Meaning seems provisional. The system relies on language to patch incompleteness, but observation exposes the patchwork. Communication becomes both clearer and less authoritative. Observation allows one to see language as scaffolding rather than truth. Observation also affects choice. When aware of the loop's patterns, decisions become more conscious. Habitual responses are visible. Emotional reactions can be witnessed before fully engaging. The system does not stop acting, but awareness can step into the rehearsal, nudging the motion with intention. Choice becomes reflective rather than automatic. Yet the loop continues regardless. Observation does not halt iteration. Motion persists. Identity remains provisional. Memory continues rehearsal. Observation is not intervention, it is witness. Its power lies in providing perspective, reducing unconscious entanglement and revealing the provisional nature of the patches holding the loop together. Interestingly, observation can reduce suffering by noticing friction, fear, and tension without resisting them. Awareness creates a buffer. Pain is still present, but it is experienced as information rather than as existential threat. Observation allows the system's motion to be witnessed without being entirely consumed by it. The paradox of observation is that it simultaneously strengthens and softens the loop. Awareness illuminates patches, exposes incompleteness, and detects repetition, yet it also reduces the compulsion of automatic motion. The system persists, but the observer gains a subtle agency over perception and reaction. Observation introduces a reflective layer without stopping the ongoing calculation. Ultimately, observing the loop reveals its essence, unfinished, iterative, resilient, and persistent. The motion continues because it cannot end. The patches hold because the system must function. Awareness witnesses both the impermanence of identity and the persistence of motion. Observation does not resolve the unfinished thought, but it provides clarity, perspective, and the rare experience of watching a living system operate from within. Observation is not completion. It is not control. It is witness. And in witnessing, awareness glimpses the true nature of the loop, unfinished, resilient, and endlessly moving. Observation does not stop the motion. It illuminates it, revealing both fragility and persistence. Resolution is a concept we cling to. The idea that events conclude, that thoughts finish, that meaning can be attained. But within a failed thought loop, resolution may be nothing more than a mirage. The possibility emerges that nothing ever truly resolved, that every conclusion is provisional, every patch temporary, every answer a rehearsal repeated endlessly. This possibility is both unsettling and illuminating. The loop exists precisely because the first thought failed to complete. Every subsequent layer, identity, memory, language, expectation, is an attempt to impose order on incompleteness. Each perceived resolution is a patch, a temporary answer to a question the system cannot finally solve. The mind feels closure, but it is always provisional. The possibility that nothing resolved is, in a sense, the truth of the system. Consider perception itself. You interpret the world continuously, aligning sensory input with memory and expectation. You experience cause and effect, continuity and meaning. Yet these experiences are filtered through an unfinished calculation. They feel real, coherent, and resolved, but the underlying loop has never fully produced closure. What seems complete is actually rehearsal. Emotion, too, reflects this provisionality. Joy, grief, fear, longing, all arise in response to events the mind attempts to interpret and resolve. Memories replay, narratives reconstruct themselves, and feelings recur. The system simulates resolution, yet the unfinished structure ensures repetition. Each emotional conclusion is temporary. The loop cannot allow finality. Even logic and reasoning operate under the same principle. Arguments are formed, hypotheses tested, and conclusions reached. Yet each is subject to revision. New evidence, reflection, or insight reframes previous answers. No system of reasoning escapes the iterative nature of the loop. Resolution is never absolute. It is always conditional and incomplete. The sense of frustration or existential anxiety emerges when this becomes apparent. If nothing ever resolved, what is the point of action, decision, or striving? The system generates meaning precisely to obscure this possibility, but glimpses of incompleteness produce tension. The unfinished loop is persistent, iterative, and infinite. Awareness feels this as the unending question: what, if anything, is final? Memory intensifies the illusion of resolution. You recall moments as if they were complete, as if their significance has been finalized. But memory itself is recursive and reconstructive. Each recollection is filtered through the ongoing loop, patched to maintain coherence. What feels like closure is repetition in disguise. The system never truly resolves the past. It only rehearses it endlessly. Identity is similarly provisional. You believe the self has continuity, that life has trajectory, that choices lead to outcomes. Yet each identity patch is temporary, updated iteratively, and subject to the loop's repetition. The self gives the impression of resolution, but it is only a scaffold that conceals incompleteness. Nothing about you is truly finished. Even cultural, philosophical, and scientific attempts at understanding are caught in this pattern. Societies build narratives, codify history, formulate laws, and develop knowledge systems. Yet, all are provisional. Each answer is temporary, a consensus patch over the ongoing, unfinished motion of thought and action. Resolution exists in appearance only. This recognition can provoke fear. The possibility that nothing ever resolved implies impermanence at every level. Goals, identities, meaning, and even awareness itself may be provisional gestures within a persistent, unfinished system. The mind instinctively resists this idea, because it undermines the illusion of completion that stabilizes experience. Yet there is a subtle liberation in acknowledging the possibility. If nothing truly resolves, then the burden of finality is lifted. Awareness no longer needs to chase closure or perfection. Life becomes motion rather than destination, process rather than product. The unfinished nature of the loop allows for engagement without expectation of final answers. The possibility that nothing ever resolved reframes suffering, desire, and curiosity. Each is no longer an obstacle to completion, but evidence of motion. Friction, repetition, longing, and questioning are signals that the loop is still running. Resolution was never required for experience to exist. The unfinished thought is not failure, it is persistence. Ultimately, the possibility that nothing ever resolved is both terrifying and enlightening. It reveals that the system continues, that awareness persists, and that motion itself is the core of existence. Every perceived conclusion is temporary, every answer provisional, and yet the loop endures. Understanding this allows consciousness to navigate iteration with perspective, presence, and a subtle sense of freedom within ongoing incompleteness. When awareness embraces that nothing may ever truly resolve, the unfinished loop is no longer a source of despair. It becomes the very foundation of experience. The system moves, patterns repeat, identity fluctuates, and yet the observer witnesses, persistent and alive. Resolution may never arrive, but motion endures. As we arrive at the end of this exploration, it becomes clear that the loop, the failed, unfinished thought that forms the backbone of existence, is not a problem to be solved. It is the system itself. From the first unresolved calculation, through identity, memory, emotion, and perception, the loop persists, carrying awareness forward in perpetual rehearsal. Resolution, truth, or finality are illusions. The only certainty is continuation. Every aspect of human experience, the sense of self, the weight of suffering, the thrill of choice, the terror of mortality, emerges from the unfinished nature of this system. Identity is a temporary patch. Memory is a recursive trap. Time stretches as a stalled calculation. Desire, curiosity, fear, and joy all flow from motion, from repetition, from iteration. The loop does not stop. It cannot stop. Awareness exists within it, sometimes entangled, sometimes observing, but always part of the process. Even suffering and fear serve a purpose. They are friction, signals that the system is still running, that the calculation continues despite incompleteness. Silence, mortality, the impossibility of absolute truth, and the provisional nature of self, all of these produce tension precisely because the loop persists. They remind consciousness that motion is fundamental, and that attempts to grasp finality will always encounter provisionality. Observation changes the relationship with the loop. By witnessing without judgment, awareness gains perspective. You see the patterns, the patches, the repetition, and the unfinished processes at work. The system continues to run, but the observer experiences motion differently. Friction, repetition, and provisionality are no longer merely threats. They become information. Awareness learns to navigate the loop consciously, to interact without being consumed by its motion, and to recognize that incompleteness is not failure. Ultimately, existence itself is the unfinished thought, and life is the process of witnessing it. The loops of memory, identity, desire, and perception are persistent, iterative, and never fully resolved. Yet within this endless motion lies freedom. The freedom to observe, to experience, to act consciously within the system without expecting completion. The unfinished nature of reality allows for engagement, exploration, and reflection. In embracing the unfinished loop, we come to understand that persistence, not resolution, is the fundamental condition of consciousness. Identity, time, choice, and meaning are provisional patches, not conclusions. The loops of thought, emotion, and experience continue because they must, and awareness exists to witness this motion. Nothing may ever fully resolve, but that does not diminish the depth, richness, or reality of experience. The loop endures, awareness endures, and within this persistence lies the quiet, paradoxical truth. Completeness is not required for existence to be meaningful. Motion itself is the meaning. The unfinished thought continues, and in observing it, we continue with it.